Jocelyn.
And I'm Danny.
And this is Why Can't We Talk About It? Welcome, welcome. Danny, how are you doing today?
I'm doing pretty good this week. The weather's getting kind of cold, so I'm kind of gearing up. Kind of got to take my fall clothes out. Got to put my summer clothes away. But you know what? I know last time we talked, I said, I kind of dread it, but I think I've kind of changed my mind. I think I'm kind of looking forward to it. And if anything, it's just more to stay warm.
It's a nice change.
It is a nice change, especially because the leaves colors are changing here. So it's something where I'm like, kind of noticing it, especially like going on a DVP lately. I'm starting to see the leaves change color. And that's when I know that I'm getting older, because as a kid, I didn't care for a damn thing about those kind of things. My parents would be like, let's go look at the leaves. I'm like, no, thank you. Now I'm like, ooh, the leaves are changing color.
That's one of my favorite things about fall is driving down the DVP and seeing the leaves change color over time between October to the end of fall. This is also a good thing to mention when our listeners are tuning in. It's probably it's not fall anymore because we record these in advance.
Oh, that's true, yeah.
So you're putting everybody back into a pumpkin spice state of mind, which is a beautiful place to be, and I am enjoying it immensely.
Yeah, very good point. How have you been?
I've been good. Yeah, I've been. This is my peak season. This is my favorite time of year, so it's a happy time for me. October is my favorite month. I wish October was 3 months long and February didn't exist. That would be the perfect year for me.
Okay. Do you care for Halloween?
I do. Not so much from a costume POV, but from a ghost tours and haunted stuff. Yes, my family is a bit weird that way. We usually go to a seance every October. Or a ghost tour, that kind of thing. I like that. What about you?
I mean, I like Halloween. Definitely more for the costumes and the candy growing up. I mean, these days I'm older now, so I can't really do that. Though I do remember that I only knew I was too old because I trick-or-treated with my friends up until the day that we went to a house where this house, they refused to give us candy because they're like, you guys are way too old. I am not giving you guys anything.
You were one of those.
Yeah, we're one of those. And then I think at the end of that night, I kind of said to my friends, I was like, maybe we are too old for this. So I think that was the last year we did trick-or-treating. So I like, but then as an adult, yeah, you can still kind of dress up if you want to, but the vibe is a bit different. But it's still nice.
Yes. Yeah. Well, what I was going to ask you as well is, do you have any recos for me this week?
Yes, so I have one. So this week has been kind of a more relaxing week for me. So I think one of the things I've been doing is just kind of catching up on the shows, watching some things where I'm like, you know what, it doesn't take a lot of thinking involved. The show that I enjoy they've had a new season now is called Archer. I don't know if you're aware of that show.
I've heard of it. Is it an animated show?
Yeah, it's an animated show, but it's definitely not for kids. It's definitely for adults. They just opened with their 13th season. So they have a lot of seasons going on. I think a bunch of it's on Netflix. I'm trying to remember where the current one is, but I've been watching that. It's definitely for adults. It has adult humor, adult topics, but it's animated. So I guess that gives that different vibe when you see it. However, I enjoy it because I guess the humor, it just kind of speaks to me, and it's just actually about a group of people who work in a spy agency. They're good, but those kind of suck. And the best person, he just drinks a lot. And I think there's a lot of luck involved. But the reason why I bring it up this week too is because I think the whole idea is that they're so dysfunctional, yet somehow they get by. And I think this week's episode, the main character, he goes to therapy. And I was like, oh, look at that. Even in this show, therapy's catching on. So I thought that was
even dysfunctional, alcoholic, animated spies need therapy, Danny.
Exactly. And so, of course, they had their spin on it. But yeah, no, I had, that's what I was watching. So for anyone who's kind of curious and wants to check it out, Archer.
Nice. Cool. Thanks for the reco.
What about on your end?
Okay, I've been recommending books for the past couple of episodes. So this time I was like, I can't come in with a book. I got to come in with something different. So this is something totally different, and it is good neck hygiene. What do I mean by that? You're looking at me like, what on earth are you
what does
talking
that
about?
mean?
Okay, the older I get in my ancient 30s, I have noticed that my body forgives me less and less. And over the past year, I've woken up several times with a really sore neck, or if I overdo it with the strength training, I can also get a really sore neck. So I have been getting massages, but another thing that I did was turn to YouTube for a solution, just for some stretches to do in between and to keep it loose. And I love these neck stretch videos by Ask Dr. Joe. So the channel is called Ask Dr. Joe. You're nodding
I know
like
her. I know her.
you've
Yeah.
done this.
Yeah.
Yeah, have you?
I've seen some of her stuff. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so she has 2 neck stretching videos, and I think they're both good, but I've come to realize that if I do these regularly, like if I do them like once or twice a week, I feel so much better. It doesn't take long. It's just like between 5 to 10 minutes, and everybody has 5 to 10 minutes in their day. If I just set a reminder and do these neck stretching videos, especially for people who sit at a desk all day, it's just so important. I think we lose sight of that, and it's important to work it out, or maybe not. Work it out is not the right term, but stretch it out. So we'll put a link in the show notes, but yeah, I do recommend giving your neck a break, stretching it out, and dedicating like 10 minutes a week to just making sure that you're taking care of yourself.
Yeah, I think that's something where I relate so much, because that's something where I've also gone to YouTube to try and find solutions. I've gone for like sessions with like chiropractors, physiotherapy and stuff like that, especially for someone who's worked at a computer for like 14, 15 years career-wise.
Mm-hmm.
And one thing that I've kind of noticed over the years is, I guess something that maybe you can relate to is like your head just kind of like starts slowly moving forward more than it should be.
Mm-hmm.
Whether it's because of working on the computer, because of looking down your phone, because of any kind of things where you're just looking down and hunching over. And I remember one thing where something for people to keep in mind too is like, if you look at your own posture, or if you look at other people who just like, walking by, you might notice it too. Like the head and the neck kind of goes a bit forward.
Mm-hmm.
Apparently it's like your ears should align with your shoulders, but mine, unfortunately, do not. And I think I have to work on that. So if you take a picture of yourself on the side, or just, because a lot of times, like, I don't look at myself on the side.
Yeah.
My side profile, like, is non-existent to me. But it's until somebody said something. So, like, I know for me, my mom has said something. Andrea has mentioned something. It's like, hey, I don't know if you know. And I'm like, no, because I don't look beside to the side of myself. I never noticed. But it apparently is noticeable.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. We're just so used to it that we don't know. So that's a good tip. Have a friend or a family member just give you a nudge. And yeah, do 10 minutes of stretching a week. Your body will thank you.
Yeah, this is a great thing to bring up. Thank you.
Good recos. Okay, so today's episode, I'm excited about it. We are going to be talking about emotional labor, the mental load, and weaponized incompetence. And Danny is the one who came up with this episode idea, and we haven't discussed anything beforehand. So I'm kind of excited for this chat to see, Danny, what your experience is like with it.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe asking why you added this topic to our roster and why it's so relevant for today. But I think it's important to start with explaining a little bit about what each of these things are for anybody who may not know what they are, because I think you told me until recently, like, you had never heard these terms before, right? Like, it's only very recently that it's kind of come across your life.
Yeah, it's definitely terms where I think this is part of our podcast as well, is a lot of the times there are things that behavior-wise that I'll notice or I'll see or I'll hear people talk about it, but there's no actual term that kind of goes with it. So sometimes when you're trying to explain something to someone, it's like you're explaining it and you just kind of hope that the other person like understands what the behaviors are so they can be like, oh, I understand what you mean. But I think I recently come across these terms, and having the terms with the explanation, I think it's easier to understand and digest. However, I think at the same time, though, just by the words itself and the terms itself, kind of hard to really know exactly what they mean. So I was kind of hoping with today's conversation is that although I have some things to say about it, I have the feeling that you might be able to kind of explain it more to our listeners and to me. It's just exactly what it is, what the difference is, so we can kind of have a better understanding for everyone going forward.
For sure. So I'm going to start with just explaining emotional labor and the mental load, because I think that those two terms are being used interchangeably sometimes, and there actually is a difference. So I'm going to read this definition from the New York Times, and it's an article by Brittany de la Cretaz, and we'll put a link to this as well in the show notes. So the term emotional labor refers to the invisible and often undervalued work involved in keeping other people comfortable and happy. This was coined by Arlie Russell Hochschild, a sociologist and professor at the University of California, Berkeley, and the term was originally used to describe the work of managing personal feelings in a professional context, particularly in public-facing jobs where employees work to produce a particular emotional effect among their customers, like flight attendants smiling warmly to make passengers feel welcome, for example. In contemporary usage, however, the term is more often used to describe labor that takes place in the domestic sphere and which is needed to keep a household running smoothly, initiating difficult conversations, managing children's schedules, remembering to send birthday and holiday cards to relatives, and asking for help, sometimes repeatedly emptying the dishwasher. These are all examples of emotional labor as it is commonly defined today. So that's just showing how the term has kind of evolved. And what that last part is referring to is what we now call the mental load, actually. So I'm just going to pause here and dive a little bit into emotional labor, because it's important to note that I mentioned it's like the work that is unnoticed in places like customer service jobs. It's also like minorities at work, members of the LGBTQ community, where when there are uncomfortable situations at work or perhaps microaggressions that take place, it's the responsibility, or I should say, the responsibility falls on those people to educate the other colleagues that, hey, this is why it's not cool to say something like that. Like the fact that the expectation falls on the person who's been made to feel uncomfortable instead of the person who is saying things that could be seen as making them feel uncomfortable to just educate themselves, that is emotional labor. This New York Times article has said that the term has evolved and now describes more of the mental load. So the mental load is different. The mental load is usually, it falls on women, and it talks about the household, and it encompasses tasks that go unseen. Like, here's like the best example. It's when a mom or a wife or a partner instinctively takes on the responsibility of planning out the grocery list and getting all the meal prepping done. And the other person in the relationship is happy to help. Of course, they're happy to help, but they want to be told what to do. Mm-hmm. Well, that organization and the planning, that is the mental load. Like taking on the work of basically being the project manager for the household is the mental load. So that's a little bit of the backstory and the difference between the two. Does that make sense?
It does. But even hearing it now, like I can see why the two kind of get intermingled.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think as much as they're two different terms, I think that at the same time, there can be a bit of an overlap, depending on the situation, depending on the scenario. But I think the idea is like, what I get most of it is that somebody needs to take on more than they should.
Yes.
Or they need to take it on because of whatever reason. Like it becomes someone's responsibility to do more compared to others in that particular situation, whether it's the work scenario, the office scenario, or in, let's say, like you said, the home where you got like relationships going on, someone is dealing with more of it, even though the other person is more than happy to, let's say, help out or listen to what the person has to say. They're just kind of like on the receiving end versus the one being the one that kind of like takes charge.
Yes, it's very well put. I think you summed it up nicely. The reason why I wanted to lay out the difference from the start, there's two reasons. The first is because the sociologist and professor who did coin the term originally has come out and said, this was years ago now, but has said that they feel that the term has evolved a little bit too much in the original meaning behind it, where it was really supposed to be in the workplace and describe that the feeling that customer service workers in particular have to put up with this kind of shit. These are my words, not their words. But I just wanted to lay it out that I wanted to point out the difference, because even the person who originally coined the term has felt like it's broadened out a little bit too much. So I wanted to put that up front. And I also wanted to point out the difference because personally, like when I share my experiences here on the podcast, I'm mostly going to be talking about those domestic experiences. I don't have as many experiences in the workplace to share, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. So I didn't want to diminish that, and I wanted to say it up front, like that is very much a thing. Just because it may not be the focus of our conversation today, I still wanted to point it out.
Yeah, and that's a good point to point out too, because we're going to have experiences that we talk about. Obviously, it's going to be specific to our experiences, but that's just because we're not necessarily bringing something up doesn't mean that it doesn't exist, or it doesn't mean that there are people who we know or listen to this or like, oh, but they didn't talk about this scenario. It's like, well, there's going to be a lot, I think, based off of what I've read about and kind of hear about or even personally experience. There's a lot, but it's so much out there that we're going to talk about things I think probably happens the most to us, or what we've seen the most. So I think that's where our conversation is going to be, which is okay. But I'm sure anyone listening too, I guess the idea is, what I'm kind of hoping is, if you listen to what we have to say, what Jocelyn just described, and you were like, oh, I remember something like that, maybe that'll help you realize and be aware that, oh, there's a term for that. It's a thing. It's not just you dealing with it by yourself. Other people deal with it too. And this is what it's all about.
Totally. I think a lot of the women listening to this are like, I've been feeling this way for a while. I do know what it is. So maybe share this with some of the dudes in your life then, because hopefully we will have a very enlightening discussion about it.
Oh, yeah. Let's do that.
Okay. So do you want to start? I'm curious, since I had mentioned up front that in our episode ideas brainstorm, you put this topic down, and I was delighted because I think it's very relevant. I have experience with it, which I'll talk about, but do you want to kick us off and explain why this has become important for you?
Yeah, so the reason why this kind of came out of the first place, I guess it comes down to how I even became aware of it. I think I mentioned before on the podcast, but I browse Reddit a lot. And on Reddit, for those who don't know, there's a lot of times people post all kinds of things, but sometimes people like to post their experiences, or people will post like, oh, does anybody else deal with certain things? And I think I've been on Reddit like for years now, and I've definitely read enough of these to kind of see trends and to see issues where men and women, or relationships in general, where people have, I guess, issues with others, or they have gripes or even just pet peeves about them. But it would be things that come up where one theme that I saw is when I guess there's a lot of complaints coming from women against their partner, boyfriend, husband, whomever. And it's about how the woman is the one who kind of has to kind of take on all kinds of tasks while their partner doesn't really do much. And obviously, it's not the case for everyone, but certain things that I've seen over and over again online is when woman talks about how, which is some examples that Jocelyn, you just mentioned too, is like, oh, the woman in the relationship is the one who is figuring out things like, okay, what are we going to have for all our meals, basically? Whether it's grocery shopping, whether it's where we're going to go out to eat, whether it's, are we going to be planning out vacation time together? Where are we going to go for our trips? What are we going to do on a time off? Hey, have you booked your time off? Have you gone to your dentist? Do you need to make a call for them? Oh, your doctor's appointment coming up, by the way. Let me remind you about that. Hey, did you forget to call your doctor? Oh, you have appointments. Did you do any of that? It's just things like that where the woman in the relationship, I'll read about how they're just like, I'm the one who has to deal with that. And the man doesn't really, it's kind of like, okay, cool. Thank you for reminding me. Thank you for taking care of this. And for those examples, the guy is more than happy to get the help. One of the main concerns is they don't want to have to tell them.
Mm-hmm.
They don't want to have to remind them. Not only does the woman already have all her stuff to deal with, it's like when you take on another person's things as well, I think that's where the issues come from. And while it's okay to help out and remind someone here and there, I think when you become their agenda and taking care of those things for them all the time, I think over time, resentment can kind of show up too over time, especially if it's not addressed, especially if it's not talked about. And I think with the mental load too, there's a comic that I'm going to put in our show notes too. It's titled, You Should Have Asked.
Mm-hmm. I love this comic.
Yeah, Jocelyn's seen it too. And I think it's something too where, you know, maybe for some people, they're visual learners, but if you see it, it kind of goes into that concept where I think the gist of the comic and how it kind of starts out is there is a household where there are things that are not done chore-wise. So we're talking about like laundry's on the floor, it's not being done. There's, you know, spills on the table, I think. And the woman is trying to take care of that while the guy is, I think, just entertaining some friends. But then while they're doing that, the cooking kind of like starts to spill or it gets on the floor. And I think the woman in the comic gets upset and she's frustrated because she's like trying to do it all. And then the guy kind of comes over. It's like, oh, what happened? And then after she explains it all, he goes, oh, you should just ask me. You should just asked. I would have been happy to do the laundry or clean up or put the dishes away. But the comic kind of goes on to explain, like, that's the whole point. It's like, why is it that the woman has to tell her partner or tell the guy to do all these things? It would be so much helpful if he notices like, hey, these things need to be done. Let me just take care of it. I don't want to wait around until I'm told to do it.
Mm-hmm.
Then I do it. So I think that's kind of where I saw this whole idea of like mental load, and it kind of brought it to a bit of a forefront just in my mind. I'm like, oh, okay, I can see how that is, and I can see how that's definitely evident sometimes. I think in obviously things I see online, you know, and some people I've seen that too, whether it's people I know, or I was going to bring up even myself, like in my relationship with Andrea. Like I can start off by giving one example, which is kind of like in the comic where there have been times in the past, and I know I've had to make some changes on my end to get better at this, which is if, let's say, she's making something in the kitchen. She's a great cook. She makes food really well. So I think she does do more of that, and I help out where I can. But there are times where I will ask her like, hey, do you need any help? And she'll be like, no. And I think genuinely she's fine. And I'll be like, all right, cool. And then I'll just like go on the computer and do my own thing. But what I'm missing in that scenario is like, there actually is dishes that need to be put away.
Mm-hmm.
There could be dishes in the sink that can be washed. There are some things that could be cleaned up and just like tidy up and things like that. But because I only asked that question like, hey, do you need help? And she says no, then I'm like, all right, I wipe my hands and walk away and be like, all right, cool. She said no. So there's obviously nothing else to do. I'll just go do my own thing.
Mm-hmm.
But reading about this online, seeing these particular comic, and actually even talking to Andrea about it, it required me to be like, oh, okay, there's definitely things that I'm unaware of. Now that I'm aware, I can do better. And I think it's also just like to play my part too, like in the relationships. Like, I don't feel like it's fair or right to leave so much on one person when I am perfectly capable of also doing those things. I think it'll be a little bit different if like I couldn't do it or things like that. And I think that's fair. But if I'm perfectly capable too, and she's perfectly capable too, then it's like, well, then why is she doing all that? Why isn't it also me? And I think that's where that discrepancy kind of starts to show up. And I think that's where there's a bit of normalized behavior, maybe society-wise, I don't know. But based off what I see, I'm like, wait a minute, that's not fair. And I think that's when I was like, okay, what can I do to make things more fair? Because I want a partner, not a mom, kind of thing.
Oh my God. Can you insert applause sound effects here? This is not an ASMR podcast, so I'm not going to do any clapping.
We'll
but
see what the editing is like.
I'm so happy to hear this. It's the self-awareness for me, Danny. Oh my God.
So yeah, I think that's like a good way to explain it too. It's like becoming aware. I guess in fairness though, I would have to say for a lot of people, based on what I've read, based on what I've seen, based on what I know, I think a lot of people, especially the guys, probably grew up in a way where they just didn't do a lot of these things. And I would say I get it, and that's okay. But if you're in a scenario or relationship where your partner's not okay with it, then that does seem kind of unfair to me.
Mm-hmm.
If someone is like, okay, well, sure, but I'm capable, but I don't want to do it. And I think that's maybe there's more to it than that. But I think for me, it's just like, yeah, like I said, it's like, I don't want to be parentified. It doesn't feel good to me. So I want to make it as fair and I guess equal as possible. And that does require a conversation, but that's kind of like the gist of why it started and why I was like, hey, let's talk about this because I think it's an important topic to bring up.
And where does weaponized incompetence fall into this? Because I think this is a good segue. And before you talk about it, I'll just do a quick definition that I pulled from theskim.com. Weaponized incompetence, also called strategic incompetence, is when someone does something badly on purpose or claims they don't know how to do something so that the burden falls on someone else. A good example of this before you dive in is if somebody really doesn't want to do the laundry very well, they mess it up by like putting all the colors with the whites and turning everything pink. And then the other person in that household has to be like, I'll just do it myself. And the original person probably knew that they shouldn't be dumping all the laundry in at the same time, but now they've gotten out of doing laundry in the future because they messed it up.
So segueing into weaponized incompetence, there's actually a pretty good article that I also have. Again, I'll put this in for our notes, but I think it's from the Huffington Post. But it does go through what this term is. I think it's been around for a while, but it's actually, I think apparently it made a resurgence, I think when TikTok became a thing a couple of years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember the reason why it came up is because, and I saw this picture of it, it was a woman who went online and basically put a post where she was kind of like laughing about it, but basically she showed a picture that she drew of a floor plan of a grocery store to give to her husband. And it outlined exactly where to like go get all the groceries. Here's where all the vegetables are. Here's where the meats are. You walk down here. And I think for her post was like, haha, this is hilarious. Look what I do for my husband. But then, of course, online, people are like, the hell is this?
Everybody, Danny can see my face right now. And the comments were like, my face.
Yeah, like that. But I think a lot of people were like, whoa, that's what you do? I think that started, it kind of brought this term to light, but also gave a little bit of a gateway towards a conversation of people giving examples of what that's like for them. So people who will say like, oh yeah, my so-and-so partner doesn't really know how to like wash the dishes correctly, so I do it. Or they don't, like an example again, laundry. Yeah, they don't really know how to do the laundry, so I do it. Or they don't know how to do the groceries, so I do it. But I think in terms of weaponized incompetence, which was the example or sort of the definition you kind of brought up, was that it doesn't have to be relationships either. It could happen in the workplace. It could happen to friends.
Mm-hmm. Totally.
Whether it's in a relationships, like someone's like, I don't really want to do something, so they'll just do like a really poor job at it in the hopes that their partner will be like, man, if I do this, if I let this person do this job, they're going to do it so bad, I'm going to have to come in and fix it. So not only do I have to fix it, I got to do this whole thing myself. Ugh, it's so much easier if I just do it myself, which technically it is. But then the other person kind of gets away with not having to deal with that task at all. So I think that's a prime example. That could happen in the workplace. Maybe you have a coworker who's like, I don't really want to do the work, so they just do such a crappy job where other people have to pick up the slack, and then they kind of just get away with it because other people are like, well, I don't want to fix their work. Let me just take care of it now, do it right so that they don't have to fix anything. But of course, then that means that this particular coworker kind of gets away with it. And then another example, I think in this article too, is something that I think Jocelyn we talked about. And that is when you are the friend who kind of organizes all the events. You're the one who takes care of it because other people might go, I know she does it better. She's better at this. And I don't really want to put in the effort or the time. So I'm just going to like either do a poor job or just be like, hey, can you do it because you do it better? Those are probably examples that anyone who listens will be like, I know what that's about. And I think for me, just to give a personal example, I want to say like, when I think about this example is that it kind of goes back again to like, I'm going to use making food as an example. Andrea is, again, great at making food for us. And, you know, I do make food too. But there was a time where I always kind of just felt like she's so much better at it. Why am I going to make some crappy dishes for us, right? Like, I don't want her to eat poorly made food. It'll be so much easier if I just kind of like have her do it. For me, it's not so much that I was like, oh, I purposely made food out so like shit that where she'd be like, ugh, I don't want to eat this. I better just make it myself. It was more like when it came time to make food, depending on the task, I'd be like, I'm not really sure how to do this that well. I think you do it a lot better. Do you mind just doing it?
Instead of taking the onus and learning it. You weren't doing it bad on purpose, but you also weren't taking ownership and being like, I can learn how to do this better.
Yeah, the alternative could be things like me just asking her like, hey, can you teach me how to do this well? Or there's YouTube these days. There's pretty much all kinds of things you can learn online.
Mm-hmm.
In my personal case, it was more like I wasn't really putting in the time and effort to be better at it. And instead, I was like, let me just push off this work to somebody else because I know they can do it better. And then there was no ownership in me being like, well, I'm capable. I can get better too.
Mm-hmm.
It was more like, let me just stay mediocre and let somebody else deal with it. So I think that's where my example is. But to be fair, I'm just going to tell you a quick story. When Andrea and I first started dating, I remember, I think I made her some easy peasy dumplings dish one time. And she was like, oh, this is great. And then we were talking about like making food. And I think one time she made a great pasta dish for us. And I was watching her make it. And I said to her afterwards, I was like, you make this dish very different than what I do. And she's like, why? What exactly do you do? Because she made it. I was like, oh, this is great. And I said, oh, so when I make pasta, basically, I just boil some pasta and then I heat up the pre-made sauce in a pan. And then once it's done, I just pour it over the pasta.
Put them together.
That pasta. While when she makes it, she's like making like the pasta sauce from scratch. She's making the meatballs from scratch. She's like putting all these things and seasoning together. I'm like, oh, I didn't know you could do all that stuff. Again, that was something where I think she showed me, but I was willing to learn it.
Mm-hmm.
But there were like I said in the previous scenarios, like, oh, I was just like, it would be so much easier if I just didn't do this? Just let someone else do it. And I think that's maybe not full-on weaponized incompetence, but there was that idea where it's like, I don't have to take ownership. It's easier for me. But then it puts that on her. That makes it more work for her. And I think that's the point of this term.
I'm just kind of like sitting here in awe because I think with all the articles that I've read about the mental load and this topic, and there's so many, and like you said on TikTok too, there's so many videos of women explaining how they experience it. I think we're setting a record here. For the very first time, we have a dude telling his side of the story, becoming self-aware, improving himself. Dear listeners, this is the gold content that you get from subscribing to Why Can't We Talk About It?
Yeah, I think that's the whole entire point of why don't we talk about it? And here we are talking about it. Though, I don't know about being the first person. If you read the article that I'm going to link up for everyone, there are definitely people in there who I think we get some commentary from other men. But in this article too, I remember there's one person who speaks about it. He goes, his marriage ended because he didn't do those things. And
yeah, there's like a article titled, "She Divorced Me Because I Left Dishes by the Sink."
yeah, I think it's that person.
Yeah.
And it's like, sorry, I think this one's called "This Is How Your Marriage Ends." But it's from a guy who basically is like, he just didn't deal with these things. And I guess the marriage ended. And obviously I'm not saying like, it goes from like 0 to 100 just like that. I imagine that if you're in a relationship where that happens, there's probably going to be like simmering resentment at some point.
Mm-hmm.
If one person is doing everything or doing the majority of it and the other person doesn't, and even if there was a conversation, someone still continues to not do anything, that builds resentment over time. So we heard a lot from me though. Let's hear real from your end. I'm curious what you got to say on these things.
I enjoyed it so much, Danny. Thank you for sharing.
Okay, we can always come back to me. I'm sure I have more. Don't worry.
You are amazing. We love a self-aware king. So thank you for walking us through how you discovered it, what your experience has been, and the fact that you are self-aware and can catch it when it happens and are working on it. It's so great. My personal experience with it was also pretty recent. It's probably like that period after Azim and I got married and we first started living together where it was like 0 to nothing for me. Like Azim and I had lived together before we were married, but my mom took care of us in the sense that she did all the cooking.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not even embarrassed. I should be, but my mom did all the cooking. I'd go and pick it up on Sundays. I'd have food for the week, or we'd go out for dinner. Like, I didn't have to learn how to cook. And our place was so small, like so small, that in terms of housework, it didn't really feel like things were uneven, because Azim is really great when it comes to splitting tasks. Like it's very equal and he does a lot of work. So I'm very lucky that way. But when we first got married and we moved out together to Michigan, so it was really like a totally new experience for me. I realized that we were going to have to feed ourselves. And I took on that task. I don't even know why. Like looking back, like why did I feel like it should be me that needed to take on the cooking? I guess it made sense because he was in grad school and going to classes like in person, whereas I was working from home, and we just sort of naturally fell into that. But what happened was when I took on the cooking, I didn't let anything else drop. So I was still doing other household chores. And then I was also meal planning and organizing our schedule so that we would go grocery shopping on this day and make sure that we still had time to do XYZ. And I would do the cooking on this day to make sure that we had enough meals for the week. And I realized that doing all of this extra work was exactly that. It was work. And I was doing far more than Azim was. And then also adding cooking into the mix was far more time consuming than I think either of us had realized, because I wasn't just cooking. So the way that we do it is I cook once and we have enough meals for the week. So I do a lot of like...
Meal planning?
Yeah, pretty much. So when I cook, I clean at the same time. And we have, and had at that time too, small kitchens, right? I don't have the beautiful Nora Ephron kitchen of my dreams yet. So I'm working with like a tiny sink and limited amount of kitchenware. So if I'm making multiple meals, I'm washing dishes over and over and over again. And it would take me hours. Like usually it takes 4 hours. That's half a day. That's half a day of work.
Wow.
And yes, at first, when I brought this up with Azim, he didn't get it at first. I had to break it down like this in a very practical way, where I said, cooking is not just a chore to add to the list. It's not like vacuuming or mopping, which Azim takes on. But I'm like, vacuuming or mopping, especially with our amazing Dyson, is a 15-minute chore. It doesn't take that much time. We live in a small place. Mm-hmm. Whereas cooking takes this amount of time. And I'm not just providing nutritious meals for us for the entire week. I'm also ensuring that the kitchen is clean, because I'm doing all the dishes as I go and then cleaning the kitchen afterwards so that it's spotless. So that is multiple chores in one. And because I'm doing multiple chores in one, and then also the planning of this, because planning out meals, I would argue, at this stage in our lives anyway, we don't have kids. People with kids, oh my God, I commend you. There's 10x the amount of work, 100x the amount of work. But meal planning takes a lot of brain power. It's budgeting, it's like making sure that we're getting the nutrition that we want. We eat fairly healthy. We don't eat a lot of meat. It's just like I want to keep it fresh. Like a lot goes into this. And when I explained this to Azim, he understood it that way. Mm-hmm. And we were able to rearrange things so that I felt like the chores were more evenly split. But it was interesting because it just sort of happened instinctively, and I didn't realize that I had just naturally taken on more until I was taking a look at my schedule and I was like, oh, I'm feeling so overwhelmed. What's changed? And it was this. So that's a very mild case of me feeling like I had more of the mental load and my partner not understanding, and we were able to rectify it fairly quickly. So I feel pretty lucky in my personal relationship that we're not at the point where I'm divorcing Azim because he's left dishes by the sink. Mm-hmm. I just had to break it down and explain it in like very practical terms that, this is why this is so much more work. And I think, just like that woman in the TikTok that you explained where she didn't realize that drawing a map for her husband to find things is like completely unreasonable. Mm-hmm. I think maybe women can get to a point where they just naturally take on this role of organizing and keeping everybody's lives in order, and they don't realize the toll that it's taking. Or like you mentioned at the beginning of this podcast, if they don't have the vocabulary to articulate it, it's just so easy for that resentment to build, or for them to not understand why they're feeling burnt out or feeling like they have too much on their plate, because they don't know how to articulate it. They don't know how to sit down and say, okay, well, being the one to remember what time the kids' soccer practice is and whose birthday is coming up, so we need to shop for a gift, and how much are we spending on groceries this week, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The list goes on. Yeah. Like that's just life, right? That's just what you do. You just do it day to day. So not taking a step back and thinking, okay, my load would be lifted a bit and I would have more time for myself to whatever you want. Insert like self-development, or sitting on the couch and watching the Kardashians, or doing a 10-minute neck stretch, whatever you want. Like you'd have more of the ability to do things for yourself and recharge and be the best version of yourself if your partner took on remembering when somebody's birthday is coming up or when the kids need to be picked up from school. Sometimes it's just hard to sit down and have that conversation and articulate it, but it is very important because we don't want relationships getting to the point where they're ending because the other person in that household isn't contributing fairly.
Yeah, and I think to kind of continue from that too is to say that this might even be a whole different topic, but I think that the reason why a lot of it is defaulted to the women in these scenarios is like it's kind of just modeled for us growing up. It's like, well, this is how my parents did it, or this is what I saw growing up. Then I think it's almost like it's a normalized thing.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's why I think it's still like such a normal thing now. The fact that we're talking about it, I think is great, but I can imagine some people might hear it and be like, what are you talking about? Like, it's fine, even though I would say it's not. But it does happen, I think, by default because of those reasons. And so I think maybe I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on this part, because what I would say too is like, even though I gave my examples, I know I have a long way to go still. I'm not saying these things being like, oh, I do things perfectly well. I still have conversations with Andrea about it here and there, or I do try to ask, like, where else can I improve? And so I know like there's a lot of work to do. Do you have any thoughts on how we can actually get better at this overall? Do you have any thoughts on that?
I do. I think this might not be the right answer, but I'm going to approach it like a project manager. But
Okay.
You know what? Okay, I'm going to pause there actually, because just in that instance, I'm catching myself because I'm like, oh, I'm applying my work self or like the way I am at work to home life. But it is the work is equal. The work is equal. So you are a project manager of your home. If you're the one at home who is like taking on a lot of these tasks, whether that's because you are in a position where you don't go into an office to work, like you don't have a job outside of the home, then you're a domestic engineer, baby. You are a household project manager, and we're not going to diminish that. So this is the way I would approach it. So with Azim, what I did was I just laid it out and said it takes X amount of time to do this, whereas this chore takes X amount of time. And like it was very clear to him, like he saw it and immediately picked up the slack. So if I had to start in a situation where it was a lot more broken than that, I'd say it's really important to have a conversation and treat the running of the household like a project. Like sit down, have an initial discovery call, a kickoff call, and say, today we're going to talk about project household. And we are going to list out all the tasks that keep project household running. There is vacuuming, mopping, cleaning the bathrooms, like all the household chores. There is getting the kids fed to school, their extracurriculars. There is family obligations, like listing every single thing out and assigning priority to them. Because another thing to keep in mind is, and we didn't touch on this, but sometimes there are tasks and chores that mean more to one person in a relationship than another. Like,
yeah, that's fair.
It might drive somebody crazy. Like, let's say you used cooking food as an example, right?
Yeah.
I think food is important to a lot of people. But let's say that to somebody, they're like, I don't care. I'll just have pasta with noodles from a box and sauce from a jar that I got off the grocery store aisle that's going to expire in 5 years. It's fine for me.
Yeah.
Maybe it is really fine for them. Maybe they really don't care. And if you're going to assign cooking to that person, sure, they can slowly learn how to improve. But if for them, they're like, this is fine for me, this is really like the most effort I can give because I'm also taking on these other tasks, then we have to set expectations and understand this. Maybe a better example is like a clean bathroom. So for me, a clean bathroom is like completely spotless, clear counter. I don't like shit on my counter. Azim likes to keep his contact, like he likes to keep the things that he uses every day on the counter. And we're just going to have to come to a compromise because he'll keep his stuff on the counter, but I want them kept in a nice, clean way, and I have to accept that. It doesn't work for him when I tell him, like, put all of it under the sink in this drawer so that you have to reach down for it every single time just to make me happy because I want to see nothing. There's going to be compromises, okay? Yeah. So what I'm getting at here is that prioritization task. Is there anything there that you can let go of? Like if you're the type of person that's like, bed must be made every single day and sheets need to be washed every 3 days, like, does it have to be like that, or can you change it a little bit? So list out all of your tasks, prioritize the tasks, and then the next step is assign the tasks. So in my case, I decided to take cooking, and I let go of some of my Kylo duties. Like that's taking care of our dog / my son. So it's so much work. I equate it to cooking, and I shifted some of that responsibility onto Azim. So assign the tasks. And then when you have those tasks, do them and don't do them badly. Don't let weaponized incompetence become a factor in this. Like I said, I don't know if this is the right approach, but for me, as a very organized person, as a very visual person, I think laying it all out like that is maybe a good step to at least get the conversation started and to try and work through it.
Yeah, I don't see why that couldn't be an approach that works. I would say that there's probably different approaches. I think that's definitely one of them. The approach I think that I would say, if we're talking about how to get better, I'm actually going to look at it from the point of view of somebody who, if they're listening to this, if they hear the topics, if they hear the terms, if they hear what the behavior is and they resonate with it, whether it's, one side or the other, whether you are the person who hears it and goes, oh yeah, I'm the person who is actually taking on all that work. Or more specifically, if you hear it and you're like, oh, maybe you become aware that, oh, actually, I'm the person who is letting somebody else take on the extra work. And I'm not really pulling my weight, or maybe I'm like, yeah, I actually just don't want to do it. And that's why I do it. I would hope that if somebody heard that, maybe have a think about it and be like, hey, am I really okay with letting my partner or my friends or my other coworkers to just take on all that extra work because I just don't want to deal with it? And is that really okay with me? Do I think that's fair? And hopefully that person would be like, yeah, you know what? Maybe it's not fair. Maybe I can do more. Let me see what I can do. I would say definitely it's not something to look at and go, I'm going to, pull a full 180 overnight. But I think if somebody can just be more aware of it and be willing to just try, I think that's actually a pretty good start for someone if they're in a spot where they understand that, oh, maybe they're the one who's letting somebody else take on more mental load in that relationship.
Agreed. Recognition is the first step.
Yeah. Great topic.
Well, I think that was a really good chat. I thank you again, Danny, for sharing your experience and for being so open. I hope the listeners got a lot out of it. I think we can wrap it up here.
Yeah, I think we can wrap it up. So quick thank you to you as well. I think it's great that we got two different perspectives, man and woman. It's always interesting to get those views. So I'm happy we could do that. I think that's it for today. So is there anything you want to add, or are we good?
We're good.
Okay. All right. Then I guess till next time. See everybody then. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.